Good evening. I'm Henry Neufeld, owner of Energeon Publications, and this is the restart of my Thursday night Bible study. There's a number of changes that are taking place. One of those means that I'm not entirely sure how this broadcast is going because I'm using a new set of software and YouTube Live rather than what I am normally used to working with. And so it's possible that things are going to go wrong. If so, I'll certainly delete this and create a new one and to upload to my YouTube channel. In the meantime, the live chat option is available with this live stream, and so you can get messages to me. Given that I have a number of things to try to work with here, that may take just a little bit of work for me to answer questions and so on, but I will certainly attempt to do so. There's going to be a few changes here with my Thursday night study. One thing is this will be a half-hour's program from now on. I'm going to attempt to blog about it a couple of times during the week ahead to add additional information, and I will also possibly do some short videos on the topic. So that will be one of the major changes. We've found with our Tuesday night Energeon Hangouts that a half hour works much better. I have a hard time sometimes understanding why somebody wants to listen to me for a half an hour, but that's certainly more likely than that they want to listen to me for a full hour. So what we're going to do tonight is I'm wrapping up my eschatology study, and then I'm going to prepare for our following study, which I'll tell you right now is we're going to build around the book of Galatians a discussion of the theology of the Apostle Paul, and particularly look at backgrounds. My specialty is more in Old Testament and ancient Near Eastern history, studying the Hebrew Scriptures, and I'm going to work with that in order to provide some understanding of Paul's world and the background of some of the ideas that Paul presents. Now, also, I'm having, just speaking technically here again, since this is a live event, I'll let you know that I'm having a little bit of problems because I'm looking at my image on one screen as I'm trying to talk, and I really should be looking straight forward at the camera, which is not above my picture right now. So I'll see how that works. And of course, when I'm all done, I'll see if we actually recorded anything. Now that I've gotten through those technical points, and let me add here, it will be next Thursday night, 7 p.m. to 7:30. I'll begin my discussion of the theology of Paul, looking especially at the background. So let's invite the Lord to be with us tonight, and then I'll go into my conclusion of the eschatology study. Lord, I thank you for this opportunity to study and to learn from your word, and I pray that you will be with us as we talk about your word, as we try to learn new things. And send your Holy Spirit to guide us, to open our minds and our hearts to both hear and to obey. In Jesus' name, amen. Okay, I am continuing in the same mode that I've been. Now, I think that some people may be rather dissatisfied. And here I go moving this thing over so that I've got so that I have the picture nearer to the camera, which will help me a little bit with keeping my look steady. And that's a good illustration for what we're going to talk about, is keeping our focus steady. I think a lot of people may be dissatisfied when you hear about eschatology nowadays. You expect somebody to outline how the end of the world is going to come. And if you were expecting me to do that, that was never going to happen because, first of all, I don't know how the end of the world is going to come. Secondly, I don't believe that you know or anybody else knows either. That's why I started up with this little badge in the upper left-hand corner where it says, "No one knows the day or hour. The angels in heaven don't know, and the Son himself doesn't know. Only the Father knows." That's Matthew 24:36, and I'm using the Contemporary English Version there. And then at the bottom I say, "Deal with it." And the fact is that we have found more ways than can easily be imagined to get around what Jesus actually said. You're not going to know this. But the second thing is, that's not a problem, because we don't actually need to know. Eschatology in the scriptures is not about a sequence of events in the end times. It is not about preparing by knowing a list of things that is going to happen. And so you could almost say eschatology is not about end times as those terms are understood right now. At the same time, you can turn around and say that everything in Scripture is some way has to do with eschatology. Everything has to do with the end times. Let me refer to the book of Hebrews. I almost always refer to the book of Hebrews, and here it is. Chapter 12, "For the hope that is set before you." He goes through, but for the hope is not, you will know when the Antichrist comes. It's not, you will know when the tribulation is starting, or you will know exactly what's going to happen during the millennium, or you're going to know the when of all of these things. That's not what the hope set before you does for you. What the hope set before you does for you is it is an end point, a point. It's a morale question. The hope set before us is what lets us live now as we ought to live. And there are several things we try very often to avoid in Christian discussion and teaching. One of those things is we try to look at salvation separate from becoming a disciple. Now, there are a lot of levels of discipleship, and there's a lot of grace that's going to go on with that. But there is nothing in the Scriptures that has us being called to sit around saved. It's always been, and from the start to the finish, about becoming God's people. Now, how do we become God's people? There is a point in time for that. How do we learn to live as God's people? That is also there as well. How do we deal with the failures that we have as God's people? That is also something that's covered, but there's always the goal to be God's people. And when you come into eschatology, that goal remains: be God's people. But then further in eschatology, there is a vision of the future of what is coming. And I don't mean by this vision the view of the particular set of symbols. I don't mean interpreting all the seals and the trumpets of Revelation, though I'm going to talk about them here in a couple of minutes. But what I'm talking about here is, as a vision, is the vision of God's people being faithful and carrying out God's work through all the trials and tribulations. The critical way in which that is going to happen is that Jesus is going to be with us all the time. If you learn out of eschatology this: God was with us at the beginning. In Jesus Christ, God is with us. In Jesus Christ, through the Holy Spirit, we can say that in many ways. And at the end, God is with us. Then you've learned what I've hoped to say in all these weeks of eschatology. And I want to illustrate this by looking at the book of Revelation. One of the things that happens when people study the book of Revelation is that they sit down, look at a verse, look at a symbol, and then you start breaking it down into words. What does this mean? What does this mean? What does this mean? When actually John is portraying a scene. Now, there are meanings in there, and there is a time to go into the greater details, but there is also an overview, and we walk into Revelation with an assumption that the overview is going to be a sequence. We think in these linear terms. Now, I have long thought that Revelation was not a single time sequence. For example, the seals that come in chapter 6, in the trumpets that come in a little bit later, and the bowls of God's wrath. These go into sequences of 7, but the second sequence is kind of inserted into the end of the last one. And so you have a kind of a cycle. At the least, you have an overlap. And so it's not that one thing begins and ends and then another thing starts. I use this scheme, and I'm going to switch here now to a slideshow pretty much for the rest of the way. I use this scheme in the book of Revelation. I wrote a study guide, Revelation, a participatory study guide. Now I'm working on revising that. Right now the book is largely a set of thought questions, but I think they are good thought questions and a basic way of viewing it. And it's that basic way of viewing I'm going to go through here today, because I think that Revelation illustrates both what I'm just saying, God with us, God with us, God with us, beginning, now, end. Always is God is with us. But in addition, Revelation is going to say something significant about what we are supposed to be doing while God is with us. That God is with us, and what is it that we're supposed to be doing during this time? Now, again, let me re-emphasize, we have the idea that the thing that we need to do is figure out exactly who the Antichrist is, when he will appear, what he's going to do, so that we aren't taken in by the Antichrist. That is not how it works. That's not the best way to handle it. What we need to do is be constantly reviewing our relationship with Jesus Christ, with Christ. If we are reviewing that, if we are living in that way, then we are not going to be carried away by Antichrist, because we have Christ. And that's the simple way to go. A lot of what Revelation does is looking at Jesus Christ. What is he doing? And looking at us. How are we relating? How are we relating to Jesus being with us? So in any case, I was looking for a way to teach this, which is somewhat difficult actually, because I just couldn't think of a good metaphor for it. It's easy to call it a sort of a future history, to talk about things like looking into crystal balls and seeing scenes, even though I think that kind of diminishes what's going on in the book of Revelation. But there it is, with this kind of very visual presentation and a great deal of good dramatic presentation. We have scene transitions. We have very well described scenes. One of the things that you can answer the question, what is this symbol doing in the book of Revelation? You answer it by saying it's there to fill out the picture, because John the Revelator is describing what it is that he is seeing. And so the answer to this came to me while waiting in line to go into the Pirates of the Caribbean game or theme ride at Disney. And let's go here. I call it the Revelation theme ride, and you have it right there. And I was thinking there in the entrance of basically of chapter 1, and then as I rode through the theme, it started to come to me. The whole thing, the nature of a pirate attack in a town, all of the defense, the attack, the results, and how everybody is going to deal with it, were all carried together at once. And then the viewer went through the scene and saw the different things that might be happening simultaneously. You could even end up seeing something that would have in time happened before, after the result of it. So at one point you see pirates sneaking up, but you come around the corner and you see them leaving, and the village is also burning, and all of these things are happening pretty much at the same time. And I thought, here's the metaphor for understanding how to read Revelation. Now it looks fairly, how should I say, straightforward, dull, and boring, the way I have it there, but I'm going to carry forward and bring a few lessons out of this from the book of Revelation. So here we are, Revelation theme ride in the entryway, and the way the entryway works is that it raises your expectations. And so there we are, and I have here two verses out of Revelation chapter 1. In the entrance, the first, it starts out a revelation of Jesus Christ. Now we can talk about that revelation coming from Jesus Christ, a revelation that reveals Jesus Christ, or to be quite honest with you, could it be both? And then you go on through Revelation 1, 9, and 10. There he is. He's on the island of Patmos, and he's in the Spirit. So this kind of leads you in. I remember as we were at the Disney ride that people would run around and use terms that had to do with, they'd talk like a pirate. They would talk about what was coming up, and it was all a way of getting us into the mood for riding the theme ride. So there's your entrance way. And so you start out, you're saying, here is a revelation that's coming from Jesus. John is in the Spirit. One of the things that you should get from in the Spirit is that we're going to get visions, we're going to be getting images and metaphors, and that we have left literal land at this point. That's not, however, the most important point to get out of what I'm talking about here today. Here we are at the entranceway, revelation of Jesus, and John is in the Spirit. What does he see in the Spirit? Well, that goes down on into the vision of Jesus, which I'm going to tie into the second scene, because the vision of Jesus is still leading in. And here we come to setting, as we set the scene, I go chapter 1, 19, and 20, even though in sort of generalization I call the entryway chapter 1, because I include giving you the vision. Here is Jesus. And then you follow from that. In chapters 2 and 3, you have these 7 letters to 7 churches, to the church, or to the angel of the church, and I'm not going to go into what angel or messenger or whatever means in the connection with the churches. But here's the key thing. There's a dramatic tie between the vision. Every church is addressed, and it's by some person with some characteristic of that image of Jesus. So it's saying, here is Jesus speaking to the churches, and from the vision itself, walking among the candlesticks, seeing the churches. So you start out with a vision of Jesus with his church in the world. God is with us. And if you get that picture first, I think it's very important to understanding the feel for Revelation. Sometimes we're looking for particular churches that meet these things, historical periods, so on and so forth. I'm not even interested in arguing about that at this point. What I'm interested in is the top part of the message to the entire church is Jesus is there amongst his church. Now, God with us is one of those very interesting terms, because for those who are on God's side, God with us is a good thing. For those who are doing God's will, God with us is a good thing. For those who are not, sometimes God with us is a point of judgment. sermon at my home church this past Sunday came out of the Church of Laodicea. Nothing good is said about that seventh church. But nonetheless, Jesus addresses the church, and that is one of those lampstands. The Church of Laodicea, no matter how bad, is one of the lampstands Jesus is walking. God is with us. That's the starting point message of Revelation. So there we have God with the church. Church in worship. I titled this next section, chapters 4 and 5, the build-up. The transition is there's a door opened in heaven and John is invited to come up here. It's a very dramatic transition between here I am looking at what's going on earth. What is going on earth? We have the churches serving their master Jesus, and Jesus is there. In heaven, we have the worship around God's throne. There's a tendency to separate these two, but in essence, chapters 1 through 3 and then chapters 4 and 5 are mirror images of each other. It's the earth and then what's going on in heaven. This sets up the scene because much of what John is shown starts from this point in heaven. He's getting a heaven's eye view. And so there's the build-up, there's the second scene and the transition, as I say. And we have a first shock. Here's the interesting thing. We're going to see 3 series of 7s, and we'll come to, in a minute, here we have the Lamb opened the first of the 7 seals. Of course, I'm skipping over the wonderful point here that it's the Lamb slain from the foundation of the world. John is told to look for the Lion of the tribe of Judah, and he looks for turns and he sees the Lamb slain. And the Lamb slain is the one who is worthy to open the scrolls. So here we have, starting in chapter 6, the Lamb slain starts to open the 7 seals. And so there's just a critical connection again there. Jesus is with us with the church. You have Jesus with God in heaven, the Lamb slain, that connection of heaven and earth and salvation before the throne that you could spend hours on Revelation 4 and 5. But it's the one who brought salvation, the one who is Emmanuel, God with us, is the one who is able to open the seals. And the seals are that's the first shock. Now we're just going through the structure here, so I'm not going to talk about horsemen of the apocalypse and all of that. We come to the first interlude in chapter 7:1. After these things I saw. Now we have a change here. We're going to see the 144,000 and a number of things related to that coming. And this happens after not 7 seals, but 6 seals. And so you have a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Hold it. We're waiting for something. And what is going on? Here's where we have the 144,000. We have a scene of the witness to the world and the separation between those who are following God and those who are not. And here's our starting point. The call of eschatology is also the call to mission. The call of eschatology is the call to carry out the gospel commission. The one really sure sign of the end that Jesus gave us, and I referred to it an earlier time, this gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in all the world, and then shall the end come. And here we are. The hold before you come to 7, before you complete the sequence, has to do with who are God's people and what are they doing. It'll become a little clearer down the road. As we go in. So we have the interlude, and then the second shock, 8:1, he opens the second seal, and kind of like it was in the seal, you have the 7 trumpets. So when he opened the 7th seal, you go into the set of trumpets. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. This is the second of 3 series of 7s in the book of Revelation. And then we had a second interlude. We have at 10:1, I saw another angel, And amongst the things that'll happen here is the testimony of the two witnesses. We spend a great deal of time arguing about who they were. What we need to be paying most attention to is what they were doing, which is witnessing. They're fulfilling that commission. That's what, again, I will say eschatology is about. So I saw another angel, and then you go to 11:15. It ends when you have the seventh trumpet, but you only get kind of the start of the end of that. It's sort of like everything chapters 12, 13, 14 are all part of the seventh trumpet, which is then going to be topped off by the pouring out of the seven last plagues. So here's what I call the timeless conflict, where we saw the beast coming up out of the sea. Timeless conflict, what I mean by that is that not that it doesn't happen in time, but that it happens wherever good and evil are in conflict. If you want to learn about or teach about spiritual warfare, read, meditate on, and understand Revelation 12 and 13. The beast coming up out of the sea and everything that follows. So there we have our timeless conflict, this new scene, which doesn't seem to bring anything new, but it is part, again, it comes under trumpet number 7. It's not that John has forgotten what's going on, but there's a lot of stuff going on here, and it has to do with God's people and their mission. So again, the Gospel Commission is happening. The Gospel Commission, it can be a thing of conflict. As we get into 14, 14 is really still a build-up. I divided it into a new scene, and anytime you're dealing with a visual thing like this, you can find different places that you might call a transition. But I made chapter 14 be building the suspense as we come through, and it includes the second instance of the 144,000, which in my view tells us that we're still in this hold it mode before everything ends. Then we come to what we call full judgment. 16 verse 1, he hears the loud voice, and the command comes is to pour out. That's to the 7 angels who have the 7 bowls, which are the 7 last plagues, and they pour them out on the earth. So there we are with the full judgment being poured out. Now, why do I call it full judgment? That's because with the seals we had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, hold it, and then we had an interlude, and then 7. With the trumpets we had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, an interlude, hold it, and then there was a 7th. So now with the pouring out of the bowls, we have 7, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and it goes all the way. And there's two things. One is to say that grace intervenes and grace intervenes, but eventually there comes a time that if somebody is going to do evil, that the full result is going to happen. And that's what happens in this sequence of 7 that does not have that interlude. There is not that moment where it says, hold it, let's look for God's people, because the expectation at this point, especially through our discussions of chapter 14 and 15, is that God's people have been separated out. So now let's look from full judgment, final judgment. Final judgment goes into the details of the end. We're still essentially like we're in the trumpet, only there was no hold moment. And so it's explaining the details. And this is indicated by one of the 7 angels. We're still talking about the bowls of God's wrath, and this is the final judgment on Babylon. This is where you get the whole Whore of Babylon imagery, and Babylon is fallen. Although the Babylon is fallen language happens earlier in chapter 14, but there, Babylon is fallen is a call to God's people to separate themselves from what has fallen. So now we have final judgment, then we come down to the final battle. Now, the key here to the final battle is the white horse, which is to say, if you go back to Revelation chapter 6, you have the white horse is the first of the four horsemen of the apocalypse. Great interpreters have debated the white horse. And the white in Revelation 6. Some have said it's the Antichrist bringing on the conflict. Some have said it's Jesus Christ going out in evangelism. But in any case, it's a white horse going out expecting victory. Now in Revelation 19:11, we're introduced to another white horse who goes out expecting victory and also receives victory. At this point, there isn't a question mark, isn't a conflict, there aren't partial results, there aren't some people, whatever. There's a complete end. The white horse represents the final victory is in God's hands. This goes back to the hope set before you, which is to say, no matter how bad things get, two things are true. Jesus is with you, and Jesus is the victor. So you have the present comfort of God's presence, the presence of Christ with you, and you have the future hope of the ultimate victory. And you have also the knowledge that the reason it goes so slowly is that God is so anxious to extend grace to everybody. And this should become the Christian's attitude in the course. If you're there in the time before that the seven bowls come and are finished, if you're there in that time, which we are, then your attitude has to be, how can I be God's grace in the world? How can I share this grace that I know? And that's why the call of eschatology is the call to the Great Commission, to bring it to the point where this gospel of the kingdom is preached in all the world. So there's your final battle. Then we draw back to an ending. A new heaven and a new earth. And I hate to do this very briefly, but I don't have a lot of time left. But I want to point here to the very critical element again, which is that, just like I said in my simple eschatology, God with us at the start, God with us through there in the middle, and in the end, it is God. God at the beginning, God in the middle, God at the end. And Revelation does that. Revelation 1, 2, 3 was, here is Jesus with his church. Revelation 21 and 22, it's a new heaven, it's a new earth, and there are God's people, and what is going on? God himself is with them. He's with them, and he's their God. They don't need light because God is the light of the place. Everything is fulfilled in here. God is still with us. So if you want to take that overarching structure, there is God is with the church at the beginning, God is with the church at the end, and in the meantime, God is working to extend his grace to all the world, and that's what he is calling the entire church to be. And if you learn nothing else about eschatology, that's really all that you need to know. Matthew 28 will do a really good job of teaching you some eschatology. So if I want, if I want to, I think I could call this, Great Commission eschatology. That is what it is about. Extending God's grace. And I'm not talking about the how or the details. Everybody wants to argue about that. But a lot of the time while we're arguing about the how and the details, we're basically doing nothing. Receive God's grace, extend God's grace. That is what it is all about. Thank you for joining me for this entire series. And as I mentioned at the beginning, next Thursday night, I'm going to be starting another study. There's several books I'm going to be using. Please check my blog. I will be putting lists of the materials that I will be using as major and as key reference points. So you will be able to look at what what we'll be using, and I will be trying to make at least 2 blog posts during the week leading up to each one of the presentations, since they'll only be a half an hour. Again, thanks for listening, and I look forward to talking with you again next week.